Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. What the hell is going on in Kenya? The country is in flames. The scenes that we are seeing in Kenya are heartbreaking. It seems this is the destiny of Africa. To always be plunging from one disaster to another, from one crisis to another. The story of Kenya and Zimbabwe have been comparable to some extent, but one had hoped that Kenya at least had done much better. I'm talking of what happened in 2007 when the elections in Kenya ended up with the violence comparable to what was happened a year later in Zimbabwe. Kenya was forced to go into a government of national unity, just as Zimbabwe was forced to go into a government of national unity in 2008. At least the opposition in Kenya did implement a number of very important and significant democratic changes. And the country emerged out of the GNU democratically stronger. But as one would say, dirty habits die hard. The following election were not exactly free, fair, and credible. And ever since, the country has been drifting back to the dictatorship that prevailed after Kenya's independence, when the first post-independent president, Jomo Kenyatta, assumed power, and then followed by his successor, Arap Moi. But at least the GNU of 2007 had implemented some reforms. Unlike Zimbabwe, our opposition failed to implement even one token meaningful reform throughout the 5 years of the 2008 to 2013 GNU. And so Zimbabwe, to be quite honest, remained on the same track. And so last year we had elections, and even the regional body and the continental bodies could not pretend that those were free, fair, and credible elections. But before I go on, let's just listen to this short clip of Al Jazeera report on what is happening in Kenya to give us the backdrop. Excuse me, I seem to be having problems to get it started. There we are.
The government has offered some concessions, but it hasn't eased the tension. So why has this bill brought so much anger, and what are the wider implications? We'll get to our guests in a moment, but first, this report from Laura Khan.
Undeterred by clouds of choking tear gas, these young Kenyans are taking to the streets in their thousands with a clear demand. They oppose the government's plan to raise $2.7 billion in additional taxes, under pressure from the International Monetary Fund. The protest, dubbed Occupied Parliament, started in Nairobi on Tuesday and have since spread nationwide.
This bill, we can't let it pass. We want to reject it completely, and that's why we are here. It's our duty to protest against the bill.
Kenya is ruled by poverty. We have no education. Most of our people are unlearned. They cannot write, they cannot read. And the government still wants to pull away the budget.
Roads around Parliament were sealed, with both the noise and the message seemingly not reaching politicians. They held a second reading of the bill on Tuesday, but not all agreed.
This bill was a disaster. This bill is assuming that the Kenyans' tax rate should move to a higher rate regime.
President William Ruto had made amendments to the bill, dropping levies on bread, transport of sugar, financial services and motor vehicle tax, proposing instead to increase fuel prices. The new budget is a response to the IMF, which has called the government to increase revenues to reduce its reliance on borrowing. But with high unemployment, inflation, and a third of the country living in poverty, many see these additional taxes as punishing the poor. And the way police handled the protests may have worsened the anger on the streets. Gillian Munyeo says her son was shot dead while fleeing from tear gas.
If someone is fighting for their rights, why use live bullets? If he would have been found with any weapons, he would have said there is a problem, but he was walking with his friend.
Rights groups who attended Thursday's protests say spent cartridges implied the use of live rounds.
It's really shocking to learn that we are living in a country where youth are losing their lives for merely exercising their constitutional rights.
But nothing appears to deter these young Kenyans who say they will remain on the streets until the government scraps its controversial plans to raise taxes. Laura Khan for Inside Story, Al Jazeera.
Well, let's take a closer look at some of the items the new taxes will cover. Most of it will apply to imported goods, including phones, computers, motorcycles, which are a common form of transport. Value-added tax will also be doubled on petroleum products from 8 to 16%. Kenya is heavily reliant on diesel for transport and agriculture. But the government has dropped additional taxes on several items, including bread, sugar, and vegetable oil, proposed levies on sanitary products.
I'll stop there. The grievances in Kenya are not different from those in Zimbabwe. I don't think anyone could argue that in Zimbabwe we have got similar problems, if not worse. And I think what makes Zimbabwe even a worse situation is that at least in Kenya, since the GNU of 2007 to 2012, they have had some semblance of free, fair, and credible elections. No such luck in Zimbabwe. Which only aggravates the situation. The people of Zimbabwe have got every right to be angry. They have no meaningful say in the governance of the country. They've had no meaningful say in the governance of the country for 44 years. 44 years of rigged elections. And meanwhile, in those 44 years, the country has been cut apart. There is, on the one hand, the filthy rich ruling elite and their cronies. And on the other, the filthy poor majority. Every day on social media and on the internet, you hear a story of how the ruling elite are wasting the nation's resources. The latest one we're discussing only the other day is spending this 87 million US dollars buying goats and starting these goats projects. There is nothing wrong per se with that idea, but this is taxpayers' money. And the taxpayer have got grounds to say it should be accountable. The success or failure of that project should be accountable. We have had so many of these command agriculture projects. And report after report have shown that the money was looted. Indeed, in this goats project, there are already stories of the individuals who were involved in the procurement of the goats overpricing the delivery of each animal and thus making millions for themselves. Corruption in Zimbabwe is rampant. And to maintain some of the basic services, the regime has had to resort to all manner of raising money from the poor. Taxes. One of the most outrageous tax was this 2% surcharge on all electronic transactions. It's 2% over and above VAT. That tax was aimed at the vendors who, because they're not formally employed, were not paying tax as you earn or corporate tax from their business. And so the Minister of Finance devised this. For every electronic transaction somebody makes, government takes 2% of it. What is making it worse is that the people do not have an option. They cannot go to the bank and withdraw cash so that they could pay for their day-to-day economic activities. Unless you've got US dollars, a US dollar account, which only recently you could now withdraw US dollars. In the past, you could not, because the bank will tell you we have no US dollar. But now, at least there's an improvement in that. You can withdraw US dollars. How long that will be last is another matter. But for the local currency, the ZiG, even if you have got it in your account, you cannot withdraw cash. The bank will tell you they don't have the ZiG. And so you are forced to use the electronic. And every time you use the swipe, they charge 2%. All these taxes are meant to raise revenue. When the Minister of Finance himself knows that there is a lot more revenue he could be raising if he went after the individuals behind the corruption. You hear stories of individuals having a number of Porsche cars in their yard. Where did that they get the money to buy all those Porsche cars? Did they pay the input duty that everybody else is forced to pay? One would want to see the tax returns of the people like this Wicknell Kifayo, if he's ever filled any at all in his life. And yet they go after the vendor on the street corner, try to squeeze as much as they can from her. I think Zimbabwe is ripe for the kind of street protests we're seeing in Kenya today. The nation has been denied the opportunity to have peaceful change through free, fair, and credible elections. SADC, the regional body, the AU, the continental body, condemned last year's elections as flawed and illegal. We have in Zimbabwe today an illegitimate regime. How else can you get it out of office? They've got the carte blanche powers to rig elections, so you can't get them out of office. But the reality of having this gross mismanagement, rampant corruption, continuing, pushing the people deeper and deeper into this economic crisis. Millions are living in abject poverty. The idea that this can carry on is simply unsustainable. I think Zimbabwe has cued itself for the kind of violent change as we are seeing in Kenya. We had a violent change in 2017, when there was a military coup. Unfortunately, that did not change much on the ground because it only replaced the current dictator, Robert Gabriel Mugabe, and the few around him, only to replace him with another Zanu PF thug, Emerson Mnangagwa. But the people were so desperate for change, they thought getting rid of Mugabe was the best thing that has ever happened. And so they went on the street to support it publicly. Only now, of course, they are regretting that they ever joined those street mobs. But that is the tragedy of violent change. Violent change, as we can see with Kenya there, brings with it a lot of destruction. And many people in Kenya have lost their lives. Many others have lost their livelihoods. And many have been injured. And it's not yet over. But what emerges out of it is not necessarily the good governance that the nation is itching for. That is the tragedy of violent changes. Whereas an orderly change has got hope of bringing orderly change and democratic change. But when people are left with no other alternative than violent change, they will use violence. And in the case of Zimbabwe, if that should happen, we have got to be honest with ourselves and admit that that change was brought about because of Zanu PF intransigence. Zanu PF's refusal for 44 years to allow ordinary Zimbabweans to have a meaningful say in the governance of the country. 44 years of rigged elections. But we must not also forget that in the last 24 years, the Zanu PF dictatorship would have ended if the opposition MDC CCC had not sold out. There's no doubt that the GNU of 2008 to 2018 was the golden opportunity the country has ever had to end Zanu PF dictatorship. MDC leaders sold out. They failed to implement even one token reform. Mugabe bribed them with the trappings of high office, ministerial limousines, very generous salaries and allowances, and for Morgan Tsvangirai, the US $4 million Highlands mansion. And they, in return, forgot about the reforms. Failed to implement even one token meaningful reform in 5 years. And ever since the GNU debacle, MDC leaders have participated in flawed elections, knowing fully well that Zanu PF was rigging, knowing fully well that by participating, they were giving Zanu PF legitimacy. They did. Continued, regardless, out of greed. It is for the people of Zimbabwe to wake up to those realities and really start addressing those problems. In 2028, the country is facing fresh elections. As things appear right now, the chances are Nelson Chamisa will relaunch a new party, come out and give the same empty rhetorical promises of we will win the elections big because I've plugged all the vote rigging loopholes. And the gullible will believe him, participate in those flawed elections, and give Zanu PF legitimacy. And we are back to where we are. Of course, we may not get to 2028. The anger in the country, in Zimbabwe, may boil over long before 2028. As much as some people applaud what is happening in Kenya, there is nothing to applaud. The violent street protests is a culmination of years of frustration, of a sense of betrayal. Much as it may achieve absolutely nothing, these young men and women are putting everything on the line out of despair. It is a pity that as a nation we have failed to address such fundamental problems that we have left millions of our fellow citizens with no other option than to resort to violence, which may not deliver the change we want. I think the fight to make sure we have got free, fair, and credible elections in Zimbabwe has got to be the #1 issue for the country. This is the holy grail for Zimbabwe. If we get to 2028, we must make sure 2028 elections are either free, fair, and credible, or we do not participate at all. Because if we do participate, we will only be giving Zanu PF legitimacy and perpetuating the dictatorship. SADC and the AU have clearly put their marker. In condemning last year's elections, Zimbabwe elections, as flawed and illegal, they put their marker. If we, Zimbabweans, had not participated in our millions in those elections, I am convinced that SADC would have had the guts to stand up and say to Mnangagwa, you are illegitimate. But because Zimbabweans participated in their millions, what could SADC do? I think we need to be smart. I think that if we get to 2028 without the kind of violence that we are seeing in Kenya happening, then we've achieved a lot. Because Zimbabwe really has absolutely every reason to be very angry and frustrated by the current political system. Zimbabweans, there are Zimbabweans out there who have had university qualifications, and yet some of them 15 years, 20 years, even more after qualifying, they find themselves without a job. Indeed, without any hope of ever having a formal job. And meanwhile, they can read every day of how billions of dollars are being looted. Their future is being looted before their own eyes. When you hear of 80% of Zimbabwe's gold is being smuggled, that's when you realize we are in serious trouble. No nation can ever prosper with such rampant corruption going on. And who is behind it? An illegitimate regime that Zimbabweans themselves, even if they wanted to, could not get rid of because Zanu PF rigged the elections. Zanu PF has been rigging elections for the last 44 years. And the last 24 years of which the corrupt and incompetent MDC CCC opposition have helped Zanu PF rig elections and get away with it. I believe ending the Zanu PF dictatorship is not mission impossible. We just have to think. And so far, as a nation, we have not been exercising our mental faculties. We need to change. Thank you very much for joining me this afternoon. Hope you'll be able to join us 7 o'clock UK time or 8 o'clock Zimbabwe time tonight when we talk about something else. Have a good day. Thank you.